You're on.
Okay.
And then eventually he got a speeding ticket somewhere between Denver and Fort Collins.
Well, good evening, friends from near and far. I know many of you. I'm Alistair So. I'm an Episcopal priest and the chair for our church's Executive Council on Science, Technology, and Faith. It's really a privilege and honor for the Episcopal Church to be able to host this gathering this year here at the Great Diocese of Utah. I want to thank them for the hospitality as well. And tonight we have our distinguished speaker, the Reverend Dr. Mark Richardson. So many of you know him from different settings, but I just want to give you a little bit about his background. So Dr. Richardson is an Episcopal priest, a scholar, lecturer, and theologian who has written extensively on faith, science, and evolution. He was the founder and director of the Science and Spiritual Quest project at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley, California, an effort which led to the publication of Science and the Spiritual Quest, new essays by leading scientists. He has authored, edited, and co-edited several other essays and books, including Faith in Science, Scientists' Search for Truth, Human and Divine Agency, Anglican, Catholic, and Lutheran Perspectives, and also Religion and Science, History, Method, Dialogue. And prior to becoming the president and dean of CDSP, which is a Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California, in 2010, he served in 3 Episcopal parishes, including Church of the Ascension in New York City, before heading to the Graduate Theological Union to pursue a PhD, writing a thesis on the 1956-57 Gifford Lectures of the English theologian, philosopher, and priest Austin Farrer, one of the leading figures of 20th century Anglicanism. Richardson subsequently became a professor of theology at General Theological Seminary and senior theological advisor to the Trinity Institute, a continuing theological education program of Trinity Wall Street in New York City. And he moderated their annual conference. He also served as chair of the editorial committee for the Anglican Theological Review. An Episcopal Church Foundation Fellow, he served in 1990. He also received his BA in History at the University of Oregon, his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and Presbyterian, and his PhD in Philosophical Theology from GTU, this Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and he also taught theology there in the 1990s. And the topic this evening is going to talk to us about Christology and evolutionary worldviews, commensurate worlds. And later on, we came up with another title which communicates better to the public, right? So, which is Christology, evolutionary biology, and theological imagination. And the format tonight will be Dr. Richardson will give us the lecture. Afterwards, we have 3 panelists. Basically, we are the responders, ask several questions, and we'll try our best to ask the right questions. As we discussed today, it's important to ask the right questions in science and religion. So, and many of you know Margaret and Luann, but we have some visitors tonight as well. So, just want to introduce them to you. Luann Trost has a PhD from GTU in Berkeley in systematic and philosophical theology, and at the present time she teaches at San Jose State University in the Humanities and Religious Studies department. And then Margaret Town, she now lives in Las Vegas, and she's a biologist and has been to a seminary as well, and works right. and a college professor, and she wrote a book entitled Honest to Genesis, a biblical and scientific challenge to creationism. And I told you a little bit about myself. Apart from being an Episcopal priest, I'm also a trained microbiologist, and I'm interested in questions about this unifying theme of evolution in biology and how we can apply that in all fields in this interdisciplinary investigation. So thank you very much. And now, Dr. Richardson, you have the floor. And that's the water thing. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I was in this group back in the 90s, I think, early 90s, and enjoyed the time together. It was a very young group at that time. Remember, Jem? You were part of it then.
I was younger.
Yeah, that's right. But it's an honor to be invited back as a presenter. I was saying at the dinner table tonight, since I don't use slides and everything, my thought probably isn't. It's probably paced for lectures that were given 20 years ago, as opposed to like the attention spans of today. And for 7 o'clock at night. But let me give it a try, and we'll see where we go. I've been working in the context of theology most of my life. As most of you know, you will not expect a presentation that is scientifically interesting from the standpoint of genetic or systems, evolutionary theory, for example. One of my goals as president of Church Divinity School of the Pacific is to press our students toward greater confidence at the interface of faith and public life on a variety of spheres, whether it be social institutions or economic ones, or spirituality and intellectual life of the culture, intellectual culture. And I would consider this presentation sort of like a case study in how one might think that way about the work of someone going into a professional degree, because mission at the church today, I believe, requires that confidence of faith and public life where we need to be. I want to lift up examples among Anglican theologians who responded to the changes in culture which followed from evolutionary consciousness, associated with Darwin after the origin of species in 1859. Anglicanism at its best, in my opinion, expects to find that our faith will be enhanced, not diminished, by the quest for integrity across domains of experience and inquiry. So we want to be exploratory. I mean, that's a virtue to do that outside in many spheres and in the sciences. The late Arthur Peacock, friend to many of you, used to say that if God is one, then the universe the scientist explores must be the same universe about which we make assumptions from the standpoint of faith under different descriptions. So there's the quest for integration is part of the task that we need to be about. I want to make the case that evolution does have a bearing on specific things in matters of faith, such as how we talk about Jesus Christ. Does an evolutionary account of our universe matter in the way we tell our story? I believe it does, and I will center this answer in some Anglican exemplars. In the early part of the 20th century, this was a period when British theology had lived in the intellectual culture of evolutionary theory for half a century. It was past the sort of reflex reaction to it, and was at a more interpretative efforts that were going on by the 1920s, the period of time that I'm thinking of. Theologians of that era were very prolific. Their constructive engagement with this was in some ways very central to their work. We know why evolution was so troubling for the religious conservatives in the era. And I think back to someone like a Charles Hodge, who has a great history, someone who has who really took great efforts to understand evolutionary theory, even if we might disagree with where he came out from. Much has been written about this, with an account of millions of years of living species, countless numbers of them going extinct, while others come onto the scene until we arrive at the present. If an all-perfect God created things once in the garden and called them good, then how do we account for the human species arriving as a branch in a vast network of life, all rooted in a common material base? as Joan Wolfgarden, Episcopalian and Stanford biologist, states, when you hug a tree, you hug a relative. Where is the uniqueness instead of apartness of the human being in this perspective? Well, I sympathize with the conservative theologian in this sense. Their beliefs are clear enough to understand why evolution matters to them, how it impacts classical renderings of the theological narratives about the human condition, and why it must be rejected. I am sometimes more troubled by progressive Christians who are okay with evolution, but do not take the next step and ask how it matters to our prayer, our faith utterances, and our trust in God. Liberal theology seems oftentimes too mushy for anyone to even know when it is potentially wrong. In fact, I think that is a danger of any theology, that it is so indiscreet and so sentimental that you'd never know when it was wrong. So it's a good thing when you could say what would be, what wouldn't work in theology, and why. I'm going to assume in what I have to say that evolutionary theory is solid, not open to debate in the general frame. The interesting questions are more about refinement on the theory. The theologian must assume that the human being is built genetically on the shoulders of millions of years of life, and life itself built on emergent layers of physical organization over billions of years. The process gives rise to the complex and fragile origins of the human being, whom we regard as distinct, to be sure, but finite and continuous with natural history. The tricky business is how a technical science, such as biology, can engage a most comprehensive level of human activity, such as religious belief and practice. I suspect you concur with me that much of the cultural dialogue today is not about evolution as it anchors the technical work of everyday science. Rather, it is the interpretation of science on the scale of meaning-making we do as human beings. It is evolution as it is more broadly, or as it has affected our understanding of time, our understanding of life in the physical universe, and the intricate interdependence of structures and systems within it. And whether life and mind are merely epiphenomenal or instead have unique value. And this involves biology mediated to theology through cultural ideas that allow us to experience the connection. Take the basic meaning question: does life have intrinsic value, or is it just physical systems blinding away, producing accidents, and there's nothing real about human agency to begin with? There's nothing in the sciences that will resolve that question today. But scientists have expressed opinions about it with lab coats on. Cultural debates are about extra-scientific questions most of the time, couched in scientific live questions. I want to take an example from Darwin's own time to make my case. The mid-19th century was not just, to make my case, that is, about cultural ideas. The 19th century was not just a time about evolutionary theory and the way it was affecting our consciousness, but it was also a time of philosophy of history, historical consciousness. In both natural and in historical studies, there was an awakening to the view that novelty and new realities come into being through the process of time. We are so used to this that we take it for granted. But for centuries, change was a sign of imperfection, not a sign that created reality is in the making. Now the possibility arises that creation is not at one time act of fixed things. Creation is continuous, and natural mechanisms are the mode of this creativity. The 19th century was coming to recognize this picture of novelty and new realities in the making. But evolutionary explanation in biology is natural explanation based on material causes grounded in the past, in initial conditions. And historical development takes seriously the idea of human intentions, future realization of those intentions, cultural purposes. One eliminates purpose and explanation. The other insists that meaning, not just mechanism, must be brought into explanation. Many of the Lux Mundi essayists, and this was one of the first group of theologians in the 1890s who responded to evolutionary thinking theologically, didn't make that distinction. They did not distinguish between evolutionary thinking and historical consciousness. So it's a case study in how these things matter in terms of the way you interpret the science into theology. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, one attempt to resolve the tension was by way of the philosophy of emergence, which I'm sure you've heard about. Figures like Lloyd Morgan, Samuel Alexander, and Whitehead. Stated briefly, emergence was the idea that the evolutionary mechanism, when seen in a large enough scale of time, presents a picture of certain propensities or patterns. It indicates an arrow of time. If we look over a long enough stretch of evolutionary outcomes, we see an emergence, to use Temple's language, William Temple, from matter to life to sentience to spirit. New structures coming into existence from simpler ones. Indeed, the emergence philosophers were asserting that nature itself has a history. The causality that we experience at the intricate micro level of evolution shows itself on a larger canvas of time to be a story about matter moving towards something more complex and rich through a subtle combination of unpredictable yet ordered processes. Why is this important for us to consider? This is a case in point of a mediating cultural idea which linked natural sciences of the day to a more comprehensive quest for purpose and meaning that occupies the human spirit. There were some essential principles of emergence philosophy. I will name a few of them. One of them is just the monistic idea that there is one basic stuff, matter, energy, that accounts for all things in the physical universe. 2, temporal emergence. New realities come into existence over time, representing new structures and new properties. And 3, about mind. Mind is not an entity or a stuff introduced to account for something fundamentally new. It is the name for capacities we associate with a sufficiently rich configuration of life that has emerged in the universe. Mind does real work, however. At the highest level of organization, there is influence on the embedded lower levels of a system. We do not have time to explore all of the theological significance of an emergent interpretation of evolution, but I do want to name that it was a very significant interpretative scheme, probably from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1920s. And then went sort of to bed for a while, and came back in the late part of the 20th century. So in summary, there are 3 important points that surface from emergence theory. First, that emergence was in the air of intellectual culture at the time of the exemplars that I want to refer to in a moment. And it affected the theologians I'm about to name. And 3, it offered a picture of the human species as not a fixed thing, plopped into the physical universe, but among other forms of life in the making, emergent from other forms of life. As Nancy Murphy once stated in a conference lecture, we are not actors on nature's stage, as we long thought. We are fruit on nature's tree. Theologically, it liberated a figure like Aubrey Moore to recognize creatio continua. So let me end there with those introductory remarks. And not so introductory, it was 6 pages, so I'm getting into it. Don't feel too bad. And I want to talk about okay, what difference does this make in terms of the theology around human origins? If you have this kind of thing taking place, what does it mean in terms in our exploration or understanding of human origins and the human condition? Let's consider one way this mattered to some of the progressive theologians at the time and why it kicked up an allergy to evolution among conservatives. And to do this, let us take one of the central stories of Christian faith about human origins as our case in point, which Margaret has written about. Much of the history of theology in the West is about the God-human relationship somehow set apart from the rest of nature. In nature, but set apart. In the picture language of Genesis, for example, humanity is more like the sole actor on the stage of nature in a spiritual drama than a fruit on nature's tree. The human being is not only set apart, it has a degree of freedom that rises above the rest of finite created reality. The Genesis account in the mainstream of our Christian thought presents the primordial human being as free enough, in fact, powerful enough to act in such a way that it could be considered rebellion against God, causing rupture or disorganization in nature itself as a consequence. This familiar story, named The Fall, sets the terms for why there is so much suffering, death, and violence. These are byproducts of a rebellious human will. What began as an original good of creation is lost and needs to be restored. Now, some might say about the account that I've just given, well, that's fine and good, but it's just a literal historical picturing of Augustine coupled with his Platonism. Well, we've moved beyond this. I would argue, however, that even the existential accounts of Reinhold Niebuhr and the symbolic accounts of Paul Ricoeur retain the three-staged logic of this story, of a lost ideal, an ideal found, an ideal, a lost ideal, and an ideal restored. And that logic is what sets up most of the telling of a Christian story. And it's perhaps no surprise, since the idea of a lost good is deeply embedded in human storytelling, not just in our own cultures in the West, but in many other locations around the globe. Now, turn away from the worldview in which such a picture of a fall originated to an emergent picture of continuous creation as background for understanding human origins and the human condition. In an emergent worldview, the human being is in the making, so to speak, and more likely coming into moral capacities very slowly, and within a very complex environment where death, suffering, and violence are already part of the experience. One is more likely to imagine the beginning of moral and spiritual consciousness to be quite fragile, and in a context more like an entangled jungle than a harmonious garden. In fact, moral awakening may be something like a trial and error process in a very slow species movement from self as the center of value toward widening horizons. After all, self-interest, an obvious natural good in an evolutionary perspective, so easily would transition to self as the center of value morally, and only slowly open up to a wider range of value and meaning. Under these conditions, reading theology through the eyes of emergence, it's fair to ask, fall from what? What ideal picture have we projected onto a primordial past? The slow and bumpy road toward moral and spiritual existence was probably more like the trial and error of a 3-year-old who wants to know how fish live after knocking over the fishbowl. The child isn't rebelling, it's exploring. But there are still consequences because the fish dies. By analogy, there are real consequences to moral awakening, real tragedy. But if human rebellion cannot sufficiently explain the origin of suffering, death, and violence, then attention for the monotheist turns to the question, what was God up to in creating a world such as this? That is, one must protect the axioms of divine goodness and holiness in a different way. And this poses a challenge. If God is the source of all there is, and not just the experience of wonder and beauty in the natural world's intricate and complex structures, then of course God is the source of suffering and death, which are inescapably built into the fabric. In fact, our own existence depends on it. Our human experience of this may include descriptions much as we have used in the past, coming right out of theologies of the fall. The present is experienced as flawed, tainted, as if something has been lost. There is a sense both of a present moral failure and still deeper disorder and defilement larger than personal responsibility. Conscience, under the conditions of competing impulses, leaves us feeling trapped, out of control, under the influence of forces we did not create. Mere existence seems spiritually murky since the natural and social systems that provide for it are propped up by suffering and violence. But here's the key point that I would make, is that that's a description we could use for ourselves. The problem is not the description of our moral and spiritual condition. The problem is our explanation for it. So that's a soundbite I hope you'll get in the Twitters. The problem is not the description. There's a deep, tragic sense that we have in our experience of life. The problem is our explanation for it. And that's what we need to explore. And the explanation makes all the difference in the world. For if you explain differently what went wrong to bring about this condition, then you must explain differently how it gets fixed. If you change the question, you change the answer. And that's why, by the way, this is an anxiety-producing problem for lots of people. They raise, what are the implications for Christology, this centerpiece of so much of our faith? What I want to do now is look at how the liberal Anglo-Catholics and the modernists, the English modernists of the 1920s responded to this as case studies. Now, who are these groups? Some of you aren't Episcopalians, and even if you were, you may not know who these people are. What I would say about them is that they were two groups who wanted to be true to the historical tradition of the Church, the creedal tradition of the Church, and at the same time very sensitive to the current culture. So they were about that task of integrity, of look at it, but they wanted to stay within their own worldview, not to feel they had to present the tradition in some kind of intellectual cul-de-sac of another era. So they were constantly in a dynamic process of that engagement. My examples for the British modernists in the 1920s and their liberal Anglo-Catholic contemporaries. A brief word about each. For the modernists and the liberal Anglo-Catholics, they wanted to live within the pressures of being faithful to their religious tradition while also engaged in contemporary intellectual culture. They were motivated to find some interface with evolution, and they found the emergence philosophy as a good vehicle for it in that period of time. Modernists went one step further. They thought that if one wanted to speak of God's action, it would be more like breaking out from within the world than breaking in from without. In other words, they had a propensity toward panentheism as a group of theologians. Thus, the modernists would interpret this emergent evolutionary history oftentimes in a panentheistic description. The world is really within the divine reality, even though it does not exhaustively represent the divine reality. The liberal Anglo-Catholics, on the other hand, well, they took emergence seriously, and yet in the end they would not speak of the world as within God, but hold to a more pronounced God-world distinction. God's central act in history are interventions from outside. And it's worth noting that this distinction between modernists and liberal Anglo-Catholics is not whether God is transcendent. For the modernist, only a divine reality that is transcendent can be ubiquitously present to all things. Unlike pantheists, the panentheists held that the world dwells within the divine reality, but divine life is not exhaustively presented by it. With this as background, consider the words of Anglican modernist J.F. Bethune-Baker in the 1920s. And this comes from his work, The Way of Modernism. He insisted that the creation-fall restoration program of Western theology in light of evolution could not be sustained. It is not useful to tie nature and history to an imagined loss of primordial goodness, no matter how tragic sin may be. You see the distinction he's making? Sin is tragic, but why hold it to a story that can't be helped, if it really is challenged in that deeper way? Words from his book. We know enough about humanity's history to be able to say that it has been the beginning of a splendid struggle against almost overwhelming odds. There are certain echoes here of romantic optimism, by the way, of the era. It's a story of ascent. But the chief point is this. There can be no question of restoration of what has never been, wrote Bethlen Baker. Creation is a very gradual shaping and building process leading to the production of spiritual beings, and we ought to slough off most of the ideas which have given us the doctrine of atonement and work out instead a doctrine of Christus consummator. Christ does not restore, Christ inaugurates a phase in the completion of God's creation. So notice he went directly from rejecting fall to having to change his Christology. He made a direct link there. Because the way we've told our story, the narrative starts with the question, what went wrong? So he had to change his answer to how's it fixed. Charles Raven, another modernist, in fact a student of Bethlen Baker, assumed with the philosophers of emergence that the inherent oneness and regularities of the natural world stretch unbroken from amoeba to man, good emergent theory. But he took a more realistic view of the shadow side of this. In fact, I see him as sort of the precursor of Holmes Ralston. The jagged line of ascent, filled with blind alleys taken by the species that lead to costly error as well as growth in moral sensibility. So here is the human species growing morally, tripping over itself all the time as it struggles forward, and its trial and error is costly. That's basically the story. With the memory of World War I in the backdrop, he wrote, "The freedom of spirit and communion is won through error, and no religious optimism must blind us to the cost of the journey. Our ancestors have trodden their via crucis and left their bones on it as testimony." Again, I think he's an obvious forebear to some of those who reflected on that theme in our own era, Holmes Ralston in particular. I'll comment more lightly, for lack of time, on the liberal Anglo-Catholics on this theme of emergence, but I'll say a word about William Temple and Lionel Thornton, and nothing right now about Charles Gore, though he figures later. Lionel Thornton, probably the most capable theological respondent to Whitehead, a philosophical theologian, believed so deeply in the dynamic of time as the motion of God and the lure of God that he conceived of sin as the comfort of staying in place when God is constantly moving forward. And so he did not use the term sin. He used the term non-attainment. I kept going through this thick volume of his, looking at that word non-attainment and wondering what it meant. And I had to go back to the secondary sources to find out. Non-attainment is sin. Thus he named it that, and the failure to keep pace with patterned forward dynamic of God's action in the world. So that was his way of taking seriously the sort of originating conditions that the human being is in. William Temple, especially in his early work, conceived of sin as placing self at the center of value, and saw it as a consequence of the natural good of self-interest in the evolutionary context. That is, sin, alienation, is explicable, not the inexplicable turn of Adam's pride. It's explicable because it grows right out of, you can understand it within an evolutionary context entirely. You don't even have to see it as a surge of the moment in the garden. If you look at Marjorie Suhaki's work, she's a contemporary that really builds on this point very nicely. The point I wish to make here is that some, with the exception of Charles Gore, whom I've not talked about yet, the liberal Anglo-Catholics and the modernists did not differ greatly on their appreciation for the effects of evolutionary theory on the rendering of human origins and sin as a human condition. They all had to reframe theology based on evolutionary thinking. When we move to Christology, then we see the fork in the road between these two schools of thought, and that's where I want to go next. It's really the end, after, with the exception of my evaluation. So when we turn to the question of Christology and what it is that the person of Jesus has done and accomplished and who he is for us, they are going to differ. So again, the question, if you change your answer to the question, what went wrong, then you're bound to answer the question, how does it get fixed in a different way? But the problem, as we shall find in Bethlehem Baker, is not that the world has fallen, but that it is unfinished. Then a different burden is placed on who Christ is for us. No longer is he pictured as restoring us to a state that never existed. I'll attempt to present salient features of the Christologies of a few figures on both sides of this time starting with the liberal Catholics. What appears to be the case about liberal Anglo-Catholics is that even though they revised their picture of human origins based on evolution, they held on to a Christ figure who enters history as if from above it or outside of it. And this comes across as an abrupt and poorly fitted to their theology up to this point, which works with the idea of natural processes as the mode of divine creativity. So you have a little sort of rupture a little bit in the thinking that has to be explained. Thus, for Charles Gore, the incarnation represents Christ who comes from above or from outside to dramatically change things, constituting a before and after of history. The works of figures such as Lionel Thornton and William Temple, to name two others, have the same tendency, and so I want to explore it. Charles Gore is the more conservative of this group. His writing occurs over 40 years from 1890, when he was considered a liberal in writing about developmental theory and outraged everybody because he saw the Old Testament as development and outraged the biblical scholars. By the 1930s, he was considered very conservative. His views had never changed. It was a marker of how much the thought had changed over that period of time. He offered a credible understanding of evolution in the first volume of the Reconstruction of Belief. What one does not find it integrated into the theology which follows. The controlling structure of his thought about God was what he considered the historical and narrative approach to a biblical worldview. And it had a practical and ethical orientation. It's very interesting reading, by the way. For Gore, transcendent must be understood within a model of the world as wholly other than God. Christ is not from within the natural world as a newly emergent phase in history. The new he represents is from beyond the world, and his essential identity is divine. Gore, on more than one occasion, stated that Christ's sacrifice unloosed God's mercy. Think of that phrase, unloosed God's mercy. He unambiguously retained the language of transaction to convey these things. Christ's death affects God's bearing toward us. Okay? And it has to do this because he's going to hold on to Paul's story to connect with it. The importance of affirming the divine status of Jesus is that only a divine figure could reverse the corrupt effects of the fall. The key effect of Christ is redemption and the reconstruction of our humanity. So what is the essential effect of redemption? Gore describes it as a radical transference of allegiance, and I quote, grafting on to a new stock of humanity which is sinless. The language of reconstruction is not clear. If sin had the effect of a physical stock of the human being, it is reasonable to ask what we are to look for in the new physical stock, the sinless physical stock, which presumably followed in the wake of Jesus for those who believe. Gore's picture is fairly traditional Western Christology. All of the communications of God to men, he said, presuppose that the normal relation of earth and heaven have been interrupted. Well, one might want to ask, what's normal? Of course, for him that meant that the pre-fallen stuff of creation. To deny this is not to question God's truth in one particular point, but to question it altogether. So the key here to notice is that the dogmatic tradition requires that we see Jesus as a response to the fall. Thus, fall is part of the gospel. See that? The whole narrative about Christ depends upon that as the starting point. So it's part of the gospel. Be able to hold on to that picture. Now, the Christology of Lionel Thornton is quite different. It's a philosophical theology, a very dynamic work building on somewhere between Whitehead and Teilhard de Chardin. And to be reached for finite persons includes what he would call the intensity of individuation, that is, reaching the capacity of what it means to be a person. And this occurs not at the cost of, but in conjunction with, the greatest possible fulfillment of social interdependence, which he called harmonization. In other words, that we are not ourselves, or even definable as selves, apart from the social aspect of being. So his work is a very interesting combination of individuation and social organism. So finite persons are complex, and their ultimate consummation consists in being constituents of a moral and spiritual organism, namely, biblically speaking, the body of Christ. This is not available from within the principles of creation itself, but an infusion into something transcendent from outside. This is what he means by incarnation. What's very fascinating about his picture is the most intricate story about the dynamics of structures and systems of the physical universe that God works through to build up this emergent process, leading to human being. Then you get to a point where it can't be fulfilled that way, so the transcendent moment comes and fulfills, taking almost without, just seamlessly on to the next one in terms of that fulfillment. So the key effect of Christ's incarnation is transformation. Thornton presents this transition from ethical to spiritual phases of human existence, first as a dynamic within natural systems, but in the end, incarnation represents a breaking in from outside the natural series. Again, the tendency of the liberal Catholic. What begins with God's action within the natural process of evolution ends with integration of conditions for completion from beyond ancient history. The cornerstone of this Christology is a divinizing function stated in contemporary form. Christ appears as a new evolutionary species introduced from outside, drawing human beings into divine life as constituents of a social spiritual organism. Incarnation represents a completion of creation. So Thornton could agree with William Temple that Christ is more than a sin solution or a fall solution. You don't have to have a fall in order to have that kind of a completion or divinization. This maps a bit of classical theology itself, where there was a division on that very topic. So finally, among the Anglo-Catholics, I want to say a word about William Temple, probably the best known of the figures that I've spoken about. Temple shows broad sympathies with the modernists in finding revelation of divine love at the heart of Christ's saving mission. It is revelation of what is always the case about God's disposition toward creation. This Christology from above impressed incarnation is a transcendent action, but divine purpose and value is already impressed upon the world. Otherwise, we would not recognize and appreciate God's particular self-communication in Christ if the logoi were not already present in finite form in creation. Thinking in terms of emergent principles, Temple held that if Christ is the personal manifestation of the Logos of God, insofar as this can be realized in the human being, then it is reasonable to expect the Logos of God was expressed in other points of history and nature at other times. And possible in principle that the Logos of God would be expressed in still more advanced ways in the future, as the context of evolving complexity warrants it. Once human beings have had their 100,000 years, the next species has its own Christ figure, its own Logos, its own incarnation. This is consistent with his thesis that Christ adds to the career of the Logos and does not exhaustively represent it. Here, the saving action of Christ is represented as revelation of grace. It is new and most dramatic presentation of what is always the case about God's disposition toward the world, always realized in ways appropriate to the particular phase in created history. So with the emergence of moral life and the capacity for evaluation of the good, love is revealed in the costliness of self-giving. as it interacts with human alienation and self-centeredness. So the key point of Christ, according to Temple, is revelation. And he represents it as a seamless relationship between creation and redemption. If the life and death of Christ represents what is always the case about God's bearing toward the world, then transactional atonement models, which suppose a before and after division of history, cannot be the case. The object of Christ is not to turn the face of God toward us, as Gore said, but to turn the face of humankind toward God. The effect of the incarnation, therefore, is chiefly educative in the fullest sense of that word. It is about our recognition and appreciation of and response at every level of our personality, cognitive, affective, and volitional, to what is the case at the most ultimate level of reality, theologically considered. This, in part, is what motivated Temple to see the person of Christ as essentially divine. Revelation of this kind must be the action of God. So when focus remains fixed on relationship, then the chief concern is redirection of the human personality by a change of heart, the conversion of desire. And that was where Temple came out, drawing humanity into a new level of spiritual communion. Okay. So in that sense, the subjective, we talk about subjective and objective Christology. He would say that subjective response, since it's a profoundly relational divine-human relationship, is not a consequence of reconciliation, but constitutive of it. It's not. If it's a relationship, it's not one way. So if there is an atonement, if there is a reconciliation, then it involves the subject. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip the conclusions. I think I've made it clear. For Gore, this Christ from above redeems. For Thornton, this Christ from above divinizes. And for Temple, this Christ figure reveals. These are the three foci that come out of the liberal anti-Catholic tract in this period of time. So what happened with the modernists? And now we're getting down to close to the end. I'm going to start with Bethune Baker again. He openly affirmed Samuel Alexander's philosophical pantheism, but he revised it in a panentheistic direction to account for the personal in theology. His own expression of it is this: God transcending the process in which he is nonetheless inherent, and of Christ as the supreme manifestation of him that has emerged in the process. So panentheism shifted the symbol of God's action towards indwelling the continuous, even if unpredictable, emergence from simple material structures toward life, mind, and finally spirit in the world, the last being divine presence in the dynamics of history. This expression of intimacy and immanence of God in the world is suggestive of one aspect of classical patristic logos theology. The logos is present throughout creation, but most supremely evident and present in Christ. If logoi were not us, we would not recognize its supreme evidence in Jesus. This was not articulated as a break in the cosmic process, but a novelty from within the frame of nature and history's dynamic process. A breaking out from within again, rather than a breaking in from without. Jesus is conceived as a product of the past on the highway of humankind's history. But he was also new, an emergence of a new consciousness, a new quality, a new specialization. This Christology was not reducible to a religion of Jesus, as it was incarnate. Rather, it denoted beliefs about him, that through their association with him, they were brought into a new and ultimate connection to God. The truth of the divinity language is to be found in the convergence of God's continuous urge to communicate, God's self, with Jesus as the high mark in God's intentions for humanity. It's the convergence of that spot. Quote, "It's not from anything I know beforehand about God that I infer that Jesus is God incarnate." I'm not sure I would go there, but that's me. Jesus Christ does not affect restoration of a former state, in other words, sometimes. But a realization of a possibility of moral and spiritual relationship between God and creation and Christus continue. Bethune Baker represents the optimism of this era, as I stated before, about retrieving from Scripture a figure of Jesus who inspires and reveals, and he claimed that what God is doing in Christ is wholly continuous with the potentialities built into and drawn out of creation. I think that if you read all of Bethune Baker, the Victorian optimism of this day is obvious. But I think if you take that part of the period piece out, there's something about the theory that holds beyond it. So it's worth your own exploration. Raven does not stray from Bethune Baker in this point. God's Spirit, he takes the Trinitarian language more seriously than Bethune Baker, saying God's Spirit is operative not only in the edifying of the saints, but in the whole process of evolution. So he has a Trinitarian view of looking at all of creation. And I won't repeat what I've said about the lack of appreciation for maybe the irrationality of violence and war that was to come a few years after Bethune Baker. But this really is the kind of context that Ray can respond to. So what he adds is both a social consciousness and a sense of the tragic in his impression of modernism. I just gave it briefly here, so and yet he doesn't stray from this Christ figure who comes from within. I conclude this section on modernism with Hastings Rachtel, a leading figure at the Girton Conference of 1921. There was a conference where the liberal and Catholics and modernists actually went to war with each other. It was a very, very biting and aggressive language. Gore took on, and the principal figure was Hastings Rachtel, who became sort of an articulate leader, the expression to the modernist point of view at this conference, the Girton Conference of 1921. So that place is basically the context. Rachtel entirely rejects the idea of the cross as decisive, intradivine transaction that saves. Jesus' death must be seamlessly connected to the whole life, and as a whole, it is atoning. The cross can be interpreted as consequence of a life that reveals the depths of divine love, but not as an intended transaction. The strength of Rachtel's study, and it's a major study, the idea of atonement, is the title of the book. It's a major piece at the time, was in holding to simple consensus views regarding atonement. In other words, throughout the history of theology, one will find revelation, education, in the most holistic sense of that word, imitation, and inspiration. They'll all be there. Now, as necessary conditions for expressing what Christ has done for us. But some would find it insufficient, insisting on a substitutionary action as the heart of atonement theory. The basic difference lingers, affecting a strikingly different spiritual tone in the advocates of each side. So he wants to stay with a minimalist picture. Why does he do that? Because he rejects also the need to tell the story in a traditional way, or origins. Incarnation is the supreme revelation of God, an example, an inspiration toward repentance, amendment of life, turning of the heart toward God. The cross is not an isolated moment, transaction, but captures the power of the whole life and ministry. These theologies do not fit with the premise of a radical fall, but with a vision of a long struggling movement in history toward a vision of life and God. His phrase is, in Jesus we see God, and that's what he meant. You were to take Chalcedon and reduce it. That's what it is. You can't reproduce substance metaphysics to begin with. His way of doing this is to say, in Jesus we see God. And that's the statement of faith. It is a more modest expression because without a false story, there's a more modest expectation placed on the person of Jesus in the history of incarnation. So what's my evaluation of this? Granting that this short presentation of major works, not short presentation, but a long presentation of much, much, much longer works, is incomplete in its details. Much more could be said about each case. I still hope that enough impressions here to show how changes in worldview inspired by science, among other things, can shape a difference morally and spiritually, even change the spiritual tone of the divine-created relationship. I'd like to say more about that, the spirituality of this, because I think it's big. I think it's maybe as huge as the Christology itself. The difference between modernists and liberal Anglo-Catholic views of Jesus are striking. The more Catholic theologians could revise theology up to a point, but then abruptly, without explanation, fitting into their worldview, they introduce incarnation as a universal, absolute intervention of God in nature and history from outside, to redeem or divinize or to reveal. Incarnation represents a decisive before and after of history, distinguishing an old and a new age, even though there is nothing in an evolutionary picture of time that prepares us for introducing eras of history in this way. One may have punctuations of revelatory moments, but decisive before and afters are less plausible if you've changed the worldview. In fact, one might want to ask, where is the evidence for introducing such imagery to capture the truth about our existence spiritually? What warrants the claim that things have changed on the scale that this view of Christ proposes? Of the Anglo-Catholic. Typical criticism of the modernists is they were romantics and could not offer a credible theology in a post-Holocaust, post-nuclear context. About this criticism, I agree. They did not account adequately for the tragic side of Western history addressed prophetically in Nietzsche, Freud, Bach, and others, so they could not fully address self and group deception or the violence that ends of the human will. They might have explained, but did not know how, from an evolutionary panentheistic outlook, one separates God from the horrors that occur in nature and human cultures. Certainly one should question whether the attitude of the modernists could be credible in our day, but all of this is a judgment on the residual spirit of the Victorian culture, not the explanation of the emergent evolutionary world. The lack of critical consciousness, however, led H. Richard Niebuhr to say a generation later that liberals believed in a God without wrath, bringing men without sin into a kingdom without judgment, through a ministration of Christ without the cross. Remember that statement? Yes. Well, can't one turn the tables here just a little bit and ask, what does the fall explanation for the condition of the human being contribute to the solution to human violence and suffering? How have piety centered in land-slaying, debt-paying, and all manner of ways to describe intervening substitutions in the middle of history to redirect the fall made a difference? Are they spiritually enlivening, or are they spiritually toxic in terms of the sense that they leave the human being? If Christ has come from outside history to change history, then where is the evidence for this change? If it's more than revelatory and eschatological promise, which is quite a bit, by the way. But what in terms of more change that is alluded to in some of these other Christologies come to that form? Granted, the modernists had settled for a more modest Christology. Jesus is the lens through whom we see God and the future to which God wants all of creation. But this modest proposal has changed lives and offered the good news for centuries. In an evolutionary emergent explanation, it should not surprise us that the production of a moral species on the shoulders of other species would lead us both to moral success in the building of community and culture, and tragic and catastrophic failures leading to violence along the way. To this condition, Jesus represents the divine intention that we bear each other's burdens, learn and be transformed by friendship, to see the face of God in the face of the other, to discover ever richer forms of community, and to discover the costliness of self-giving love lived into the divine life itself. In this model of Christian faith, we see these things supremely in the figure of Jesus, so that in him we see God. And this precisely is the meaning of the Incarnation. In this respect, the modernist solution, modest and practical. I am compelled by such a theology. Its spiritual tone is compassion. We all struggle to reach a higher moral spiritual ground in the face of our anxiety and the reality of death. We need holy compassion. We must offer it. The saving effect of Christ is discerned in what we do with it once it has inspired us. What God does next with us is nothing we can know. There's room for faithful agnosticism there. But we can trust on the basis of grace experienced abundantly in the life that we do know. Thank you. You know, probably needed slides. Okay. Break it up. So, yeah, we'll let him set that up.
I'm gonna move it so it's in the middle. Oh yeah, sure. Sure.
We're ready? Good. So the three of us will ask up to 2 questions each, and depending on the time, we'll open that to the floor, and we can have further discussions. And tomorrow morning, we'll break into small groups as well, with 2 questions specifically selected by Mark. So, Mark, thank you very much for your inspiring keynote address, in particular on Christology and the impact that we have seen from the evolutionary worldviews. You mentioned something about principally about the fall and how that affects the gospel. But I'd like to bring in another aspect of that. You mentioned the Council of Chalcedon a little bit, right? That was the 4th Ecumenical Council, and generally accepted by Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants alike, in which basically the dual natures of Christ being both divine and human were defined. And some of the language used was like this, that one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in 2 natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. So now that we have this knowledge about how humankind came into being with this long evolutionary process, and you have mentioned in that very figurative language that perhaps we're not really actors on nature's stage, but a fruit on nature's tree. So with that in mind, what does it mean in terms of our Christology when we say Christ is fully human? Knowing that that concept of human is not static, being informed by this new worldview. Would you like to speak to that?
I think it's problematic to try to simply work within a 4th century metaphysics and unwrap this paradox of human and divine. And we probably can't stay there because we don't assume the same metaphysical background. We don't share even the same understanding of personhood as reflected in these councils. I wouldn't be the person to ask that question in the first place because I function as a contemporary philosophical theologian dealing with this on very different terms than the council came up with. But your other question is another piece to it, which is sort of the evolutionary perspective on the human being. Probably, in terms of the nature of the human being, there's been more cultural change than actual biological change over the period of what we're talking about. So there's probably not a lot of change there. There's a lot of intellectual change, cultural change in our understanding of the human person. So I think of your question more in terms of the full course of natural history. I think big history is fun to look at once in a while because of the perspective changing it does for us. who are we in relation to species that might come after us? A heuristic question. What kind of Christ would be necessary then? How would we understand this? Actually, William Temple asked that question. He expected that in principle there could be an incarnation that made sense for the next species after us. So the question that you pose in the form of how do we understand Christ or this personality in light of an evolving human being, I would place in even a larger history. Why do we need to even form species lines that are really discrete if we have a particular view of divine presence in creation? It's another way of thinking about that.
Thank you.
What I really appreciated about your presentation was you did a lot of history of Christianity, and that's not my expertise. I have done a lot on the evolution thing, but what all these different people have thought, these theologians and all, was very interesting. But what I would like to make is some comments, and then I would be really happy to have your response to it. Science has showed us how humans are different from other animals, and one of the main ways is that we have this amazing brain that has given us so much power, and this idea which was repeated over and over and over about the fall and Jesus then coming. And I guess what I'm saying is that God gave us an amazing gift, and that is free will. And in free will, we decide what we want to do or say, and we err because we're self-centered, and so we sin, we lie, we are greedy. This idea of free will, because we've been given this amazing brain. And one of the things that's been interesting to see how scientists have studied other animals, and the apes and all, to see the connections and the choices they make. So this idea of us being self-centered and choosing wrong, I think that's why that to me is what the fall is. When we talk about Adam and Eve and the fall, I don't, the fall was mentioned over and over. So this idea of free will and that we make wrong choices, and to me that's what Jesus came to show us, an example of making right choices. Jesus loved others. He gave himself. He has given us examples of how we can serve and we can have compassion and forgiveness. And so I guess I would like to have respond to my idea of the fall as being the fact that we have this amazing brain and that we make wrong choices. You were mentioning World War II, the wars and the violence and all. Yeah, we make wrong choices. And I think that's where our faith has come in. And it would be interesting if somebody made research to see how much the fact that Christianity has had on the history of the world in having fewer wars, maybe, and fewer things being stolen, and more forgiveness. And anyway, I guess I'm asking this question to ask you to respond to this idea, because over and over I was reading about the fall, and Jesus came to show us that we can use our brains in a better way.
You're right to see the will as key into the story of the fall, right? I think that something about the sciences sort of almost begs us to do some revision on our understanding of that free will, that it's not isolated and decontextualized. In fact, it's not even biologically decontextualized, but dependent upon, it's premised upon capacities such as our linguistic capacity, which is very unique, but it still builds on the species that come before us. There's a leading up to capacity for language. Capacity for language is a capacity for symbolic thinking, to anticipate a future. Morality doesn't exist without that. Morality doesn't exist without a deep sense of memory, and the capacity to connect the patterns of one's life to this anticipated future. So there's a variety of sort of, you might call them biological human conditions that lead up to the kind of brain that we have, that leads up to the capacity to be a moral species. I'm not questioning what you're saying about there being a will. I think, in fact, if we are not finite agents, we may not be as free as we think. I would say that. But without some sense of agency, then the way we tell our story and the way Christianity becomes unrecognizable in the end, without some understanding of the role of desire, the capacity for conversion, the capacity to know the good. Jesus was a good Jew. He built upon a moral system that presupposed all of those things you're saying. And in a sense is unique in some ways about that, but in many ways he's just a very good Jew of his day on that. And again, I would just go back and say you're right about the description. We're a volitional species, and we do wrong. It has tragic consequences. I don't think I can explain it according to the way our traditions explain it, or decisions, based on the way I think that's an effect probably of contemporary worldview.
This will be my second question. And I believe in evolution, obviously. I mean, I'm with you on that. And I guess I've always had the question of where was the point where this child now is human and they have the possibility of becoming a Christian and going to heaven, and there's life after death. I think that we would say for the other animals like the alligators and the monkeys, they die, that's it. But humans have life after death. Where was that point where somebody was born and they were human, but their parents weren't? There had to be a line there where humanity began.
We'll leave that open to other people who might not answer the question. I don't hold your premise. I don't know what life in that divine reality will be like. I don't actually think that we're the only species that God wants to enjoy. That's just, I mean, put it simply, I mean, we could all fill that out in different ways. Anybody else want to take a
It seems to me that one of the implications of evolution, well, I would say the implication of evolution is the fact that we can't make these sharp species statements. And theologically, the kinds of statements that we have, particularly in Ephesians and Colossians, about God's ultimate purpose for all things, really ought to free us from the concern that we have to separate humanity sharply from other species.
You know, another thing that's so interesting, just 1 second, is that metaphysical backgrounds shape our answers, and to the extent that we've been Platonists or Cartesians over the years, we make those kinds of separating out. I mean, it was out of a deep faith of Descartes and being a good scientist under his own classical mechanics that he had to make room for a non-extensive essence of some kind in a human being, because as a Christian he had to believe there was something set apart there. But an Aristotelian doesn't need to do that. So even, it's interesting how different layers, I mean, I think we're confusing things. Emergence is one layer of organization, of interpretation, but at a higher level still are the more ultimate thing, comprehensive levels of theism, panentheism, atheism, or whatnot. And so I don't want to get confusing, but those things matter in the way that we tell these stories. That's
I would agree with George. I mean, the whole creation is growing into a veil waiting for its redemption. And God is still creating a new heaven and a new earth. And that doesn't mean that everything in the old earth is going to be wiped out except us.
Thank you, Mark. It's wonderful to hear you present. I had the delight to work with Mark at CTNS for some years. He was in the doctoral program when I started my work at the GTU, so it's a little bit of a reunion for me. Lovely to reflect on your thoughts on these theologians. And I also want to thank you for that introduction for me to many of those theologians who, of course, you know what I was studying at CTNS, so I wasn't studying those theologians, and yet I have a great appreciation for them. I did some Temple, and I find their work in your interpretation of them very enriching and fascinating. So I should ask my question, and you might expect I have to ask the standard one of these standard Lutheran questions, I suppose, because this set of theologians begs for it. I suppose I appreciate greatly your evaluation and critique of their lack of, well, of the optimism of the age and, and their approach. And so you did tell us, and I was very appreciative to hear of Ranschel's work, 1921 conference, where he did deal with the death of Christ integrated with the incarnation. Of course, that is, I think, fundamental to a Christological and soteriological understanding. So I appreciated knowing that that theologian among them did deal with that. But I suppose I'll let that question stand. Among these theologians, perhaps, or beyond them, what about the approach to the death and resurrection of Christ as integral to a Christological understanding of a new, even of a new worldview? I want to include that. I think the way you integrated this with an emergence understanding of reality, I greatly appreciate it. But I wanted to ask, well, if we, and I agree, the three-pronged understanding of the fall does not fit with an emergence understanding, but would, even within that worldview of emergence, what about the suffering in creation? I know you mentioned it, and I know you don't discount it, but is there a way to integrate it a little more fully into the account of creation, redemption, etc.? And do you see this, this is probably more than one question, do you see this kind of doing away with all of the traditional approaches to the atonement? These guys really did seem to be moving beyond that, most of the traditional approaches. Let's see, what was, oh, I guess that I should summarize that line of thinking in terms of the question about do you see other implications in terms of emergence, even for a thinker like Ranschel in the way he does integrate the death of Christ with the incarnation?
I don't think it was an accident that you didn't read Ranschel or Bethlehem Baker or Reagan. All of the British theologians of this era, and I did say this in the intro, were under the shadow of the great forces of the time, and that's where basically Karl Barth started. And so most of us in America were reading German theologians, not British theologians. Doesn't mean nothing was going on. I try to impress that there was some very productive work going on. I think I keep going back to the fact that they would tell the story of the death differently because the pressures were different once you don't start with the origins the way you have classically. So the death is the culmination of the character of a life of self-giving, which is revelatory of the way of God in a world such as this. You've read that in plenty of contemporary theologies, of which I'll allude to. But I think that's the direction that they go. It's not transactional. It's not a situation where Christ, where there's an intra-Trinitarian activity in our behalf. And that's what I meant by before and after, where there's a transaction that actually changes something about God's disposition or ours that is decisive. None of them tended toward that, with the exception of Gore. So that even those who had a sense of the essential divinity of Christ within liberal Anglo Catholics, they had basically walked away from that in that period of time. And it sort of is a huge gap between that and a Karl Barth in that period of time. Huge.
I don't want to end the conversation, but really two questions. Actually, it's about 15, but one is an interesting question, I think, about seeing this this parsing of perspectives. I was not familiar with the language of the Anglo-Catholic, liberal Anglo-Catholics and the modernists. But I wonder whether or not you would see that same sort of theological sensibility distinction between someone like a John Horton and an Arthur Peacock.
Oh, yeah. I think you do.
Yeah. Second question.
I think Peacock, if you read especially the last works, but even when you go back to the Book of Creation, I actually have some quotations from him. They could have come out of Bethlehem Baker almost directly.
The other question is, I wonder whether or not, when we think about the cross, we need to see the whole of creation in its process as cruciform. That is, that the tragedy, the violence, and so forth are built into, not built into, are expressed in as a consequence of the freedom of creation, and that redemption is the eschatological hope that lies before each moment, which is open to a new realization that is not dependent upon that previous state. It is dependent upon it, but not absolutely dependent upon it. Where grace might be described as the underdetermination of the present by the past.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. It's a very interesting one. I think that's the direction that I think Suhaki is going, the moral agency, and the eschatological direction. She states, and I'm going to quote her here, the human species no doubt carries forward aggressive and self-interested inclinations of other species, but with the added emergent capacity not to act out immediate self-interest as the trigger of action, more positively to draw by the emergent social reality toward empathy, and she states that in a longer phrase, eschatological. So there's that, what if? There's almost like you're at a turning point every moment. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a sequel to my first question. I'm going to ask this question based on biology, but this is a theology question, so I think it fits in very well with the keynote presentation. A lot of the thinkers and theologians you talked about, they face this evolutionary theory, and then they had to come up with a new theology to accommodate that and to answer questions around the world they found themselves in. But we live in a different time and space, and some recent research by evolutionary biologists seem to suggest that humankind may have indeed arrested the evolution of our own species. The reason being that evolution is based on, principally based on natural selection. And at the current time, despite the infant mortality rate in different places, we are keeping about 95% of the species. So if indeed this hypothesis were true, and there were data substantiating it in the years and decades, centuries to come, what impact would that have on this line of thinking from these theologians? And what are your thoughts on that? And then another aspect to it, of course, that even if humankind had indeed arrested evolution of our own species, that doesn't stop the evolution of other species. So what does that mean for the kind of world that we're going to find ourselves in? Yeah, I know you talked a lot about the species evolving into something else, but if that were not going to be true, then what?
I don't think my argument depends upon the answer to the question. Really, I mean, I don't know. I find it intriguing what you're saying. We're probably doing more information selection than natural selection right now. And who knows how much our capacity as Homo habilis in our blood is affecting the future of the species. How cultural effects have a downward loop to change who we are going to be in the future. I don't know. I mean, it's not so much a theological question. There are better minds to deal with it theologically and otherwise than mine. But I do think it's an intriguing thought that we've slowed down a certain kind of biological evolution by certain factors in our...
Oh, and I meant that that goes back to then the Christology. What does it mean then, Christ being fully human, knowing this new human reality that may be true?
So are you answering the question that actually something did change?
Yeah, pretty much. It altered it.
So Christ actually did. There is evidence, you would think, for the fact that that something, there's a before and after, and there's evidence of it in culture.
That's one of those questions of trying to figure out how to say it correctly. I'm a huge follower of Girard's work. And what I find so compelling about Girard's work is the way he effectively demythologizes the mechanisms of redemption. He finds a scientific basis for what we would call original sin in his mimetic desire, in the way that runs amok in the community. He finds the act of sacrifice as a way of holding that off, and then Jesus, in fact, reveals the lie that animal sacrifice is based upon. The problem with Girard's work, though, is that he ends up not really having a way to talk about what the resurrection is. He's essentially rejiggered the meaning of the atonement, and he's lost sort of a context for the resurrection appearances. And I'm struck by the parallels in what you're describing in both the modernists and the liberal Anglo-Catholics as they go back and find a scientific or emergent meaning for sin as a necessary consequence of evolution or a temporal experience of reality. How that changes necessarily their understanding of the atonement. But I'm curious, while you would see them dealing with the implications then of the resurrected Christ, of a bodily resurrection, or do they have to be forced necessarily into some sort of metaphorical resurrection?
This is a very curious point to me. The modernists appear to be more liberal and have gone off a little bit further than the liberal Catholics. If you look in the table of the indexes to the works that I mentioned, the Reconstruction of Belief by Gore, the more conservative, Thornton, or Temple, you very rarely even see the mention of resurrection. It's hardly there.
Same problem you have.
Yes, it's the period of time where incarnation is so central that resurrection is a footnote, and resurrection does show up in the modernists because they were more interested in getting behind the cumulative dogma of history. They were part of that idealism to get back to origins as much as possible with the Barton narrative. And in doing that, they were forced to deal with the question of resurrection. If you look at Bethany Baker's work, his early works looked somewhat promising on having a robust view of resurrection, and it just peters out by the end of his career. It's not there anymore. And so resurrection becomes something like a metaphor for just the presence of Christ in breaking bread. Not that that is simply itself a metaphor, but it is a sign of something else. But if you want to talk about bodily resurrection, none of them go there.
I think the anemic
doctrine of resurrection becomes a strongest critique of this work of rejiggering the atonement. And if you're going to sort of attack this line of thinking, that's what you're going to do.
See, I don't think in principle the change that occurred with modernists on the meaning of the death require a wimpy resurrection. They don't require it to the extent that it's a divine affirmation of a way of life and of a revelation. Right?
I would like to see that demonstrated.
I would too. It's just not there. They just didn't do it. Yeah.
But
I don't think it's in principle.
You assert it could be done. You just argue it hasn't been.
I don't think it has been done. I don't see anything logically why it couldn't be.
I'm just remembering the legal
I think one could say that the resurrection does not really play a critical role in any of the traditional understandings of atonement. That is, I mean, Christ died for our sins. Well, what? It's okay. What? You know, if you use, for example, the Anselm or penal substitution or various things like that, Jesus died, Jesus paid our penalty, and so forth. What does the resurrection have to do with that? And so I don't think it's just one or another theory or the modernists who, or Anglo-Catholics who had a problem with it. It's just that it doesn't play a role. It doesn't mean that people didn't believe in it very strongly, but it's not centrally connected with that. And I wonder if you're familiar with the understanding of atonement of Lutheran theologian Gerhard Forde. And I suspect the answer is no, because most people don't tend to be.
Give us the time frame.
I think, well, he died just like 10 years ago, something like that. But this is presented. He presented this at least in one place in the early 1980s. But I don't think it got much traction beyond Lutherans, and not even that much among them. But it has the merit of fundamentally not being based on a theory of what needs to be accomplished with atonement, but simply the understanding that atonement is getting rid of our faith in our idols and restoring faith in the true God. And the resurrection, in fact, plays a critical role there in showing us who the true God is. But I sort of, as a phony question, because as I said, I kind of suspected that, like many people, you wouldn't have been familiar with it. Which I don't mean as a criticism, I just mean as a statement of fact.
I've never read that, but I think your other point is a good one, and that is, if you look through theories of atonement, resurrection doesn't come up as a solution to any of those theories, or a necessary ingredient in telling the story.
Yeah.
Isn't resurrection more integral part of the Christus Victor?
It's part of Christus Victor, yes, that's true, yes. But one could, yeah, that is true. But Christus Victor, on the other hand, didn't tend to get that much emphasis until Alain.
Well, it won the first millennium.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I should say in Western systematic theology.
Walter Wink brings it back.
Right.
In his own way. Yeah, just send the mic down.
One response to Alistair's comment, question about, whether humanity has effectively stopped biological evolution of humans, and I believe you said, first, that doesn't say anything about the further evolution of other species. Lauren Isley, evolutionary biologist, argued pretty strongly at some points that basically, because of the position that we, as king of the mountain, whatever, now, king of the hill, humanity's never going to let any other intelligent species really evolve on Earth as long as we're around. We will exterminate it long before it starts showing significant challenging intelligence.
What's the implication for Christology?
I'm not sure on the implication for Christology, although it sounds like it does speak pretty strongly of human sin.
respond to that. It's kind of the same tone that I spoke earlier. I don't see that it is necessary to make that kind of sharp distinction between humans and other species. I mean, if one wants to use classical language, which is indeed one can debate, but simply for the purpose of stating this, if Christ, in assuming human nature, assumes our evolutionary history, and therefore has that relationship with the apes and other species as well as with our own species.
The entire rest of the natural world, right?
Yeah.
With regard to Alistair's point, it seems to me that we haven't done away with natural selection. We've simply become a major factor in it, perhaps, in terms of our own selection as an ongoing species. So that's that issue. I wonder, though, whether or not the question about the resurrection goes something like this. By virtue of the tradition, we have said that the wages of sin is death, where death in some sense is the evidence of the consequence of sin. Would then the resurrection be the evidence for the consequences of the atonement? That is, it's the measure of the restoration of life in the face of the overcoming of sin. In fact, Scripture even talks about it as the victory over death is connected with the victory over sin. So the connection with the atonement is evidentiary of its accomplishment.
Well, what is the atonement?
In that case, well, and I'm thinking in terms of it ends up, I think, in terms of the biblical account as being one or another form of substitutionary action and so forth. But
Does it need to be?
no, I don't think so. I'm not arguing the point. I was simply trying to get to this question of what is the function of the resurrection. I mean, cross and resurrection go together. You don't want to separate them. There's also sin and death go together. And so I guess the ratio I'm working on is death is to sin as resurrection is to the cross.
Can I respond to your response?
Thank you, Jim. I think I just want to clarify when I said some reports say that we have arrested natural selection. That really just means that we're not letting some of the natural selection forces take away the weakest members of our species. It doesn't affect yes, there's natural selection happening in other places for sure. And I wonder, second, in terms of the second question circling around about resurrection, whether Mark, you think these thinkers would then consider the concept, the theory of the conservation of matter, conservation of mass, as an approach to thinking about the resurrection, since there's only so much stuff in the universe, right? They have to be recycled at some point. What do you think of that?
None of them went there, with the possible exception of Thornton. They just didn't. I don't think they were. Their theological imagination took them there.
What about yours?
I'm not capable of responding, but I can price around microphones.
So towards the end of your presentation, you signaled that alongside the implications for Christology, there were equally profound implications of all this for spirituality. And without asking you to do an entire presentation, I'd be just interested either in your assessment of how well these thinkers handled it, or your assessment of what the most acute implication for spirituality is in this.
Say a little bit about what I mean from it. That is, if you take away the three-step logic and you have more of an ascent picture of human species almost beginning like a moral infant, the spiritual tone of that is more compassion or a lure forward. The spiritual tone sometimes is very toxic in popular religion around the fall. It's a kind of judgment. Think about infidels. The kind of judgment and the taint that is associated with finite agency in that tradition. So I'm not saying that that's the best of that tradition, but I am saying that there's a spirituality difference there. And I think most of the people that I refer to are pretty clear about that. They're sort of in their ascent mode as opposed to an ideal, lost ideal, and then restored. The spirituality reflects that lure. There's no lack of finite judgment. It's almost on ourselves, right? You know, but there's no loss of divine presence or the returns or the loving Father to the prodigal Son comes to mind, you know, as the kind of God revealed in these circumstances. That's what I meant by it.
You mentioned that how a question is framed is going to shape how answers are formed. And I'm going to ask a question about the theologian's understanding of evolution. There's been a lot of interest in the late 20th century in Darwin's idea of group processes of selection, which wasn't given much attention in earlier stages. And my impression from your presentation is that they were looking at we're not looking at group process as selection as part of the phenomenon or the framing for their theological examinations.
I would say that in mathematics there's such a thing, as you know better than I, interpolation beyond the precision of your terms. That would be the case here. But I think the general impression that they saw would not get to the detail. They would not have seen the implication of what he said. They would have still taken the point of view that given the natural background to the emergence of a human being, no matter whether it's systems understanding of this, social understanding, or a more of a genetic understanding of it, wouldn't matter. Picture would be the same.
More questions? You have one.
Your last sentence says, what God does next with us is nothing we can know. There is room for faithful agnosticism, and I wondered if you might define what you mean by that. But we can trust on the basis of grace experienced abundantly in the life we do know. Faithful agnosticism.
There's a lot we don't know about what God has in store when I die or you die. And I like the Lucan words, into your hands I commend my spirit. There was no verily, verily, I say unto you, this is what's going to happen to me. So there's, in a sense, that's a form of, I don't know, I trust. But what do we know?
That verse that
Now,
says,
some say that, you know, they've had people come back and visit them and given them very clear pictures. Hasn't happened to me, so I'm staying with my agnosticism. No.
that verse that says to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Sounds like
Yeah, that's picture language. I think much of our religion is based on picture language. Being with Christ, being in the presence of Christ, does not. I mean, I have my hunches about stuff, but I don't know what resurrection life is. That's what I meant. Do you? I mean, if you have something to say about anybody, want to answer that?
I'm stuck on this idea that the world is changing, but we're not. We're not attaining. I mean, is our inability to form a moral position and an ethical position on a changing world? Is that what they're talking about as sin? The fact that we've got climate change and we seem incapable of establishing a position, a moral or ethical position, or economic justice? Is that the kind of thing he was talking about? Would that fall under that?
Yes, I think that and all of the above. You could name so many ways in which we can imagine God drawing history forward, and we don't want to go. We're too busy counting the family jewels. Think of the state of the church is in right now. Is that are we really praying and listening to the future of the way communities gather to pray?
No.
Okay. Not that you have an opinion on it. You get my point. I mean, there's so many ways that you could say that we have not attained. We've decided to stay put, and the motion of God is still going on. And so alienation comes from the distance that's created by that difference of agencies.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any other questions? Then let us thank our keynote speaker.